Low latent inhibition is simply the inability to filter out information that's not useful to an individual or approaching familiar stimuli as unfamiliar stimuli. So let me explain what that means in the context of everything I've spoke about. So my idea of why psychoses and schizophrenia happens is that there is a lack of a reality framework due to a breaking of trust from a reality framework, which leaves the person in a position of not really knowing what reality is and what reality isn't, which then produces the effect of having a large amount of distrust to the environment. And effectively, low latent inhibition kind of supports this in a strange way, because low latent inhibition means that you can't filter out stimuli of which is not needed, not necessary. And that makes sense, because if a person who has got psychoses, which we know is an 80% prevalency rate of having adverse childhood experiences, a bad, childhood upbringing, that person's going to be on high alert, and their brain's going to be on high alert as well, and they're going to be paying attention to a lot more stimuli than, say, other people would. And where this really kind of impacts people with psychoses is if you've got the mix of low latent inhibition, then you're really looking at stimuli as if it's novel stimuli all the time. And as an example of that, I might look at the G key on my keyboard one day and it's just a G key. But then as the days are going on, I might slip and I hit my finger on the G key. And for some reason, I feel like maybe that is a sign that subconsciously I am trying to go towards the G key. And then the G key has a new meaning. And so then it's not just a piece of familiar stimuli, it's now growing into a different piece of stimuli. And so you might think that about an environment. You go to a restaurant, say, 100 times, and eventually, after a while of going to this restaurant, you kind of tune out the noise, you get comfortable going and ordering and picking up the menu, and you don't really notice all the things that you've seen in the restaurant all the time. But with someone with low latent inhibition and even psychoses, what they'll notice is that even if they've been to the restaurant 100 times, it constantly feels like it's a novel environment. And the reason that I think that that happens is because you can't truly, really define something. And it relies on a lot of trust to attach stimuli to something. For example, people and their intentions. When you're raised in a good environment, you get to know people's intentions and you get this building of trust, which then allows your nervous system to relax and just pay attention to the important stimuli. But if you've been abused or you've been traumatized by people, then all of a sudden everybody becomes a potentiality for that, and we don't really know how to fix that other than defining as the best as possible what an individual is. And so low latent inhibition ties in perfectly with psychoses, because if the person lacks a reality framework, a way to attribute things into categories in the mind, then there's no way of really categorizing anything, which means that it could all potentially be some form of threat to the brain. And low latent inhibition is effectively that. It's the inability to trust the stimuli in the environment at a really deep neurophysiological level. And so the brain is constantly paying attention to all the stimuli it can, in effect, so that it can constantly scan for threats. That's my thought as to why it's included in psychoses and schizophrenia. And we do know that studies have shown that the people with psychoses and schizophrenia seem to have low latent inhibition or reduced latent inhibition. And so it's really interesting thinking of it like that. As the days go on, the more I realize that I think I'm right about my idea of psychoses being a breakaway from a reality fabric. And the more I hear about things like latent inhibition, the more I realize that, yes, it definitely is probably true. And one of the things that this is teaching me at the moment, which is really frustrating, is just how luxuriated some people are to be raised in good homes, in good environments, in safe cities and towns, where they don't have to be subjected to even this line of questioning in the first place. I used an example in one of my videos that when you watch something happen in front of you, as it's, someone passing away or an accident happening, that feeling that it gives you, where you feel unstable and worried if that thing's going to happen to you next, is exactly what it's like for people with psychoses in reality. Once the trust has been broken from reality, and the things in the world have happened to break that trust, it's a very overwhelming experience of, well, what is reality? What do I cling to? Where do I belong in this? And low latent inhibition, I think, is a response to that, where do I belong in this? Because if the brain doesn't know and it can't anchor itself into a concept of reality, then it has to pay attention to all stimuli, and it struggles to build that trust up to ignoring stimuli. We have a part of the brain called the reticular activating system. This part of the brain is very much responsible for filtering out noises and things that we don't need to pay attention to. So, for example, they did a study of this where they had people who slept next to an airport which they observed people who slept next to an airport were able to stay asleep when the planes were landing and taking off, which rattled the house a bit. But as soon as their child or infant stirred or moaned a little bit, they would wake up. And so the reticular activating system can learn to ignore certain things and sounds and pay attention to other things. But the thing is then, how does that become programmed? If you've broken from reality, how do you start to learn again what things to pay attention to and what things not to pay attention to? Because you've had this distrustful situation arise, there isn't really a way that humanity increases trust in people, if that makes sense. If we look at the disease of schizophrenia and psychosis through the lens of lack of trust or some fundamental breaking of trust, we would be able then to encourage people back into society. But unfortunately, the way that we all work at the moment is very much cold and isolated. And so you don't really get many people including others, especially if they seem to be a bit of an anomaly, into the reality fabric anymore, which I suppose it's quite upsetting and frustrating. But that's my rant over. That was low latent inhibition. Have a great day.